Back in the year 2000, I was finding my feet as a freelance graphic designer after failing one paper at what is now AUT. I had studied what was referred to then as multimedia. Essentially, it was just an introduction to many of the technologies we use and take for granted today. Back then, though, they were still emerging. I got access to free internet in the computer labs and spent countless hours scrolling through Art Crimes, aka graffiti.org, an expansive graffiti portal created and maintained by Susan Farrell and Brett Webb. I fast realized that there were graffiti scenes emerging everywhere in the world, including places you wouldn't expect. I had a growing collection of graffiti magazines, mostly out of Germany, and between those and the event pages on Art Crimes, I realized that there were these things called graffiti jams. They were in essence just large gatherings of graffiti writers painting live in a format in which the public could watch their process and engage with what was normally a highly elusive art form. One of the most significant events at the time was the meeting of styles in Wiesbaden, Germany. It took place in the Kulturzentrum Schlachthof, a sprawling abandoned area in Germany's Frankfurt-Rhein-Main region. The event attracted artists from across Germany, Europe more broadly and beyond, including from the United States. I had never attended one of these events, and I didn't figure I was going to get to for a long time, so I decided to organize my own, Disrupt the System, which became the graffiti component of the AWR Hip Hop Summit. In many ways, this style of event was a prototype for the large mural festival. Many artists from the graffiti scene in that era became central figures in the movement's next permutation. For my first three events, I mainly had guests from Germany and Australia, but in 2002, I invited two artists from the US, Totem 2 from Atlanta, and today's guest, Ewok, originally hailing from the Midwest. While in Auckland, he painted numerous pieces at such an evolved and high level, one on the Newland Wall of Fame that set a benchmark for our local scene until the present day. Whether Ewok knows it or not, this has been a common thread throughout his career, elevating and painting graffiti at the highest possible level without compromising the true foundation of strong letter structure with clever connections. There's always been stigma around graffiti, beyond its origins or its illegality. Graffiti has constantly wrestled with itself because it's a highly niche subculture with its own aesthetic parameters, its own system to critique that bear no consistent relationship with the contemporary art world, let alone public opinion. So, in the mid to late 90s, as graffiti evolves to include its earliest iterations as large themed wall murals, you see a tendency amongst artists to focus on elaborate backgrounds such as environmental landscapes, and people begin to camouflage their pieces in tricky ways, rendering them as animals or objects. Ewok is part of the AWR and MSK crews, and an interesting thing is how, for the most part, the artists in these crews avoided following that trend. If you look at the likes of Crush, Tyke, and Saber, the work they were doing during this era centered the letters, which were rendered in a highly technical way. The background elements tended to extend and connect back to the core letter shapes. The power of this work was how unapologetic it was about being graffiti. Many people borrow from its attitude, aesthetic, and approach in both the mural and fine art scenes, but for some reason being an actual master of graffiti is still looked down upon. Perhaps it's changing though. Recently I've seen more large murals with genuine graffiti-centered themes from the likes of Wayne, Does, Quest, and Stare to name a few. It feels refreshing, and it's wonderful to see it embraced. Ewok has supported himself over the last 2 decades working as a graphic designer and illustrator within the streetwear industry, but he's reached an important fork in the road, and I sense he's about to do his most important work. All right, Ewok, thanks for joining me today.
What's up, Els?
It's so good. I've known you forever. You're another crewmate, but you're actually the first person from our crew that I ever met. Going back to, what was that, 2002, I think, that we brought
2001 or 2002? It was before it was before my daughter was born, and she was born in 2002, I think.
Yeah, it was 2002.
Yeah.
And you came all the way up to New Zealand for the Aotearoa Hip Hop Summit.
Yeah.
And I feel like you painted some really benchmark pieces that kind of there's some people who have been trying to still achieve that level and are still riffing off those pieces today. Yeah, no, absolutely. Little Elliot said to me that, all I'm trying to do is paint that Ewok piece from the New Lynn Wall of Fame from 2002.
When was this?
Oh, he said that to me like a couple of years ago.
Okay.
He's like, he was probably a little half cut and getting really animated and passionate, and wound up, and he was like, all I'm trying to do is paint this damn piece. I'm just trying to recapture that energy still.
That's awesome.
So let's get into a little bit of your background. So you're originally from Minnesota?
No, I grew up. Well, I was born in Memphis, Tennessee.
Oh, you were born in Memphis. Wow.
But, I don't remember any of it. It was before I was have memories. And then I grew up in Wisconsin.
Oh, wow.
And I ended up, I basically lived there till I moved away for school, and I ended up going to Minnesota for college.
Oh, wow. That's so funny. I always thought you had grown up in Minnesota.
No. I mean, it was kind of like I was born as a graffiti writer, basically, in Minnesota. I mean, I was kind of dabbling with what I thought was graffiti, in my beginning stages before I moved to Minnesota. But I would say when I actually started painting pieces and stuff, it was when I was in Minnesota.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Okay, so that gives me a couple of things to explore. So pre-Minnesota,
yep.
And you say you were dabbling.
Yeah.
What was your introduction to graffiti at that point? And then we'll fast forward to Minnesota. What then solidified that?
Yeah, I mean, I was always into art and I was always drawing and stuff. So anything that was visually stimulating to me was inspirational. And, I would just see graffiti from time to time. It wasn't really something there wasn't a scene that had been established in Milwaukee, or at least not that I was aware of. We started seeing the beginnings of there was actually some writers probably the last year or two before I moved away to college. And, but this was pre-internet. So you had to just find your photos or your inspiration wherever you could get it, because it wasn't you could just go online and look at stuff, even finding subway art and spray can art was, kind of a mission. Occasionally you would stumble on it at Barnes and Noble back when bookstores were a thing. But, so we would just kind of, nerd out on at that time I was more heavily into skateboarding, but I was always doing art, and then graffiti was kind of something that was sort of piquing our interests at the time. Two of my friends, one of my best friends, this guy, Ember from HM Crew, he and another one of my friends, Ed, they went away one of the summers when we were in high school. They went to, I think they were camp counselors up in upstate New York. And when they came back, they were all I guess a bunch of the kids that were at the camp were little graffiti writers. And so they came back and they were wearing the big Q jeans, and they had Air Maxes and stuff. And they were putting me on to all the stuff they had learned about graffiti while they were there. So we started just dicking around with getting Magnum 44 markers and doing shitty tags at our skate spots and stuff, on the curbs and all that kind of thing. But I feel that was kind of a sort of a fetal stage of graffiti, because I didn't really know stuff, I didn't know that there was a difference between tags, throw ups, and pieces. I had probably seen all of them, but in my mind that was just graffiti, I didn't have classifications for it or the vocabulary to kind of categorize it. So yeah, that was basically where I was at up until I moved to Minneapolis for school. And that was a really fortunate time, I think, just because it was a little further ahead than Milwaukee in terms of there being a scene. There was probably, I would say maybe 20, 25 active writers that were all kind of varying stages of beginning their graffiti careers or whatever. But some of those people were, a couple 5-10 years ahead of me, who was basically just getting my feet wet. So that was like a fortunate time for me to go there, because I didn't feel like I was too far behind, but I still had people that I could like learn from and just see it. It wasn't like a common thing where you would see any kind of graffiti in Milwaukee before I moved. But when I went to Minneapolis, especially like around the campus and in Uptown, like there was, the beginnings of like the scene that really started kicking off at that point. And I think I just kind of lucked into being there at the right time.
That's really cool. I find it interesting that even people in, different regions of the United States still dealt with that weird kind of feeling of isolation, and where media and stuff was so scarce. I mean, obviously I come from one of the most remote nations on earth. So
yeah,
the first copy of Subway art I got had no cover, had probably about 15 owners and had tags and drawings all through it, and it was years before I saw like even the front cover of that book and what it looked like, where I'd have some old hype magazines that some Australian writers would take pity on us and give us their crumbs,
That's funny.
Like, I find it really funny that the United States also had that. I mean, it's a big place, so
yeah,
it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at that time, and I guess this kind of played into like the beginnings of my career, but at that time, I feel like there was maybe like 5 or 6 cities in the United States that had like a noteworthy graffiti scene. I could be wrong, but that was just my understanding of it at the time. It was probably like New York, Boston, Miami, like New Jersey, New York, whatever. And then LA, San Francisco, Chicago had a pretty old scene. And those were like the main places that we were, like trading flicks or just getting inspiration from at that time. Pretty much all of like the magazines or any of that kind of media stuff that we were able to get our hands on was coming out of one of those cities.
So who was like really influential to you? Like, I mean, I've always seen like, okay, so I'm going to try and break down your style from my perspective.
Okay. Yeah. I want to hear this.
I think you've always had a real good eye for like traditional foundational New York graffiti. I think the letters always came first. They've always had structure and strength, that makes me think East Coast. But then you also had this kind of organic thing, which I sort of kind of equate more with like LA writers, like someone like Tyke or somebody, like as somebody that comes to mind as someone who sort of had that blueprint too. And I sort of wondered like kind of who you were actually looking at that time, who was inspiring you.
Yeah, I mean, well, like what era are we talking about? Like very beginning, or like after I had been actively painting for a couple of years?
I mean, I would say my awareness of your work sort of comes like kind of very late 90s onwards is kind of like where I become aware of you. But, that's also because that's when I became much more active.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, probably at that era, it was most of like the AWR guys, specifically like Tyke, of course. He influenced me a lot. Crush, Bless, Push, pretty much everybody that was really active and really had like unique, just stylistic contributions at that time were, and I feel like, super fortunate to have gotten down with AWR, MSK, just based on the fact that, a lot of my favorite writers from the 90s were like, AWR dudes or MSK dudes. So yeah, I mean, I think, around like mid to late 90s, it was pretty much AWR. Also, Dream TDK was a big influence. Just, I don't think a lot of his like DNA shows up in my work necessarily, because his stuff was like so uniquely good and he had such good like connections and stuff. But yeah, he was a big influence. Dream TDK, rest in peace. But I think the foundation, even like before the time that we met each other, I was influenced by a lot of the Minneapolis people just because that was what was around, and we didn't have access to a lot of other influences. As the years went on, we started trading flicks with people from like Atlanta. I started trading with Sever before I'd ever met him, started trading with like Dax. And then we started doing Life Sucks Die magazine. So we would get packages from kind of all over the country. Just to, but I feel like because, living in the Midwest, we were kind of looking at everything. We were looking at San Francisco, we were looking at New York, we were looking at Miami, Atlanta, whatever was popping at the time was kind of like just got thrown into our blender and we sort of just digested that and, pooped out whatever we were doing at the time.
So let's talk a little bit about Life Sucks Die, because that's actually like a really interesting chapter. And like, I'm sure that there's a lot of writers who are too young to have like really experienced like the magazine era. Mm-hmm. And your magazine was definitely already a bit of an outlier. And, in that era, because it was collaged. It looked like it was hand collaged, a lot of the layouts, or digitally collaged, but with a hand collage kind of aesthetic. Yeah. There was a lot of gore, kind of weird, kind of porn references. It was very dysfunctional. The types of musicians and things that you would sort of, you would have some more like a reference to G.G. Allen or something rather than like Rakim.
Yeah. Well, we kind of had everything. Like, we listened to everything and we were influenced by everything. That was an interesting time. I mean, it's kind of funny, like the way that magazine started out was either towards the end of before I graduated from school or after I was out and trying to figure out how I was going to like pay my rent and stuff. I started working at Kinko's, which basically turned into FedEx Office. But yeah, Kinko's was like a copy, place where you'd make like photocopies and I, for whatever reason, I was like working the graveyard shift. So it was usually just me and like either a manager or like one other like coworker. And so we would just kind of fuck around a lot and like, make our own projects or, friends would come in and they would run off like a jillion copies. Before I'd even started working there, somebody put me on game about how to get free photocopies because they had it was like a little blue box it was like a key thing that you plugged into the copy machine and it counted how many copies you made. And somebody showed us that like if you kind of hit the key thing on your palm, the dial will roll back. So we would sit in there for hours, like just xeroxing beans and stuff. And we'd walk out with like a duffel bag full of like paper and, we'd roll it back to like maybe 15 copies and pay like, $2 or $3 or whatever. So we were already kind of on that level or that frequency. And then I ended up getting that job and it was kind of just like, I think being young and kind of broke, we were really enthralled with the concept of like networking our jobs, So like, I remember there was a summer where a lot of my friends worked at this one mall. There was like a skate shop there and a place that made like smoothies and sandwiches. And then there was like a Foot Locker. And so like, and there was back when people were getting physical photos, there was a place that developed photos. So I had friends that kind of worked at all these places and I worked at Kinko's. So we would just kind of trade favors and like, we could go to the mall and like get a sandwich, maybe get some wheel trucks for our skateboards, get some Air Maxes, it's just like this like kind of black market of like basically stealing shit from our jobs and like trading it with other people or whatever. So it was kind of cool. And that's basically how the magazine came about. We didn't really, I remember at that time, one of the driving forces behind it was like, I think even more so than like everybody was trying to make a name for themselves. But I think because we were all collectively from this sort of like, mid-sized city that most people had never heard of. Like I remember going to Paint Lewis and like Scribble Jam back in the day and people would ask where we were from and we would say Minneapolis. And they'd say, "Oh, Minneapolis? Where is that?" And they would have some like make believe like part of the country that they thought it like they didn't even know what state it was in or whatever. So we like our mission was kind of trying to put like our scene on the map, you know, because none of us had really gotten any notoriety or had any shine like nationwide at that point. And so like we were all kind of collectively just trying to put Minneapolis on the map. So I think when we started doing the magazine, it was mainly like just trying to take like the best artists and, you know, pieces and stuff from our scene and kind of make like a little catalog of it that we didn't really have a plan, but we figured we could maybe mail them to different places or whatever. One of our roommates that we lived with, he was originally from Boston, but he was going to school there. This guy, Monk from AKB SCA crew. So when he would go back home during the summer, we would load him up with a bunch of like Life Sucks Die magazines, and he would, you know, kind of distribute them amongst the Boston people. And so we started getting kind of a rep over there, and, you know, it just kind of gradually grew. And at a certain point we were like, oh, like we can maybe make, like, I don't think any of us were trying to make like a real magazine. We just were trying to like make like a little portfolio of our work. And then once the seed got planted, like, oh, maybe we should do like a real magazine that just kind of like the doors opened, and we were kind of like, well, we can sort of do whatever we want, you know, like it doesn't have to be just graffiti. We can, and I always like, I feel like there's sort of a through line from like the magazine to my blog that I did later to even like Instagram or like stories content of kind of like baiting the hook with the thing that people want. And then also like Trojan horsing in a bunch of other stuff that they don't necessarily want, but I feel like they need to look at. So
I sort of feel like the content was a little like kind of proto, kind of where the internet went with humor and everything. Like, you know, like I feel like it was a sort of a precursor to that kind of weird, disaffected, kind of dystopian kind of sense of humor. Like people that are like, it's strange, like, you know, kids that just feel really disaffected or whatever, and the shock value, like there was a lot of shock value.
Yeah. I mean, some of it, like looking back on it, is kind of cringy, and like I feel like, well, this definitely didn't age well, but at the time, you know, we were just young and dumb and just going for it, so it kind of has a charm on that level, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so I wonder about how you came to connect with AWR and MSK. Like, how did that kind of bond kind of actually get, like, you know, formally made?
This is I'm kind of hesitant to even tell this story because it includes a person that I don't really fuck with anymore. But, you know, for the record, it was this guy Kept, who I used to paint with a bunch in Minneapolis, and we were pretty tight for a while. And then he was originally from Boston also, but I think something happened like while we were in school. His parents relocated to the West Coast and were living like in the Bay, like in San Francisco. So during the summers, he would go back and, you know, he would paint in San Francisco. He linked up with Bless. And so like when school year started up again, he came back to Minneapolis and we would continue painting or whatever. And so since he was in contact with Bless, a lot of the flicks that he was sending back to Bless, because we were still mailing, you know, like photos through the mail at that point, you know, stuff that me and him had done together. And I guess, you know, this is what I was told, like Bless was like, oh, who's this guy? And he's like, oh, that's Ewok. He's one of like the Minneapolis people or whatever. And, you know, just kind of went from there. Eventually I ended up getting put in the crew, and I ended up going out to Bless's wedding. I think this was in like 95 or 97, something like that. And ended up like meeting all my heroes and stuff. Ended up, I tell this story in every interview pretty much, but the first time I met GK, he was coming back from a wedding earlier that day. Like, I think we met downtown somewhere, and we were all going to go to an art show. And I was super excited because I had seen GK like on the, what was that talk show? Gabby or whatever? Gabrielle?
Gabrielle?
Yeah. but I didn't know what he looked like because he had the wig on and the
wig and the bandana.
Yeah. So like, and even though I had seen the show, like, when you see somebody's work for a long time and you start forming an image of what you think they are, and then when you meet them, they're never like that. Like I had this vision just based on like, what a menace he was, bombing wise, that GK was like this, 6'4", like hulking cholo dude that was just like, like just psycho. And then I meet him and he's like this skinny, like me, not short, but like my height, white dude that's just like super unassuming looking. And he had just come from a wedding. So he's wearing like a 3-piece suit. His hair is combed nicely. And he's driving a station wagon with like wood paneling on the side. And I was just like, this is the polar opposite of what BK was. But yeah, he was super cool. Like, I was pretty starstruck because I met like Saber, Bless. I think I met Tyke later, but I met like a bunch of people. Saber drove me around all day. Like the first day I was out in LA, we linked up with GK. And so he's sitting there in his 3-piece suit, and we were outside of like a In-N-Out burger. And he's like, "Oh, you want something to eat? You want like a shake or something?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll take a shake." And I just remember GK walking back with a chocolate shake in his hand, wearing a suit. And I was just like, "This is weird as fuck." Like, like I would have never imagined this scenario happening. We fire or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I think I went off on a tangent. What was?
It's a good tangent. It's a good tangent.
Yeah.
So, but how did you formally end up getting invited into those crews? And because it was rare, because for one, you aren't from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So it was odd. Like, I mean, I think like there were a few people who technically weren't from LA or the Bay that were in the crew by that time, but to be from the Midwest, and then secondly to also be put in both crews at the same time was kind of also a bit rare. Well,
I wasn't. I mean, I was put in through like basically Kept, who's a dick and I don't fuck with anymore, but I was put in via him by Bless, and at the time Bless, from what I can remember, and I don't want to like. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but Bless was very pro AWR. It didn't seem like he was super hyped on MSK. And based on my perception of the crews at the time was like AWR was kind of the older, more seasoned, like piecing dudes. And MSK was kind of like the young, hungry, like psycho bomber dudes like GK. And a lot of those dudes like Saber and GK, I think were in both at the same time or whatever. But there was kind of a division in terms of just what people were doing between AWR and MSK. And Bless was all about like AWR. Like, I don't think he was pushing MSK super hard. So when I got put in AWR, he's like, yeah, we're family with MSK. It's basically the same crew, so you can put that up if you wanted to. But basically the way he said it was sort of like an add-on or something, and I felt like it would be kind of disrespectful to the people that were like mainly MSK to just have it, like me just get thrown into that crew just as like an add-on or whatever. So I wasn't technically in MSK until the day that Pose and Arrow got put in, because we were on a trip in Barcelona, and I was talking to Eclipse afterwards or whatever, and it was always weird. Like, there was a couple times where somebody got put into the crew, but I didn't, like, nobody gave me a heads up that they were doing it, and so I'd kind of just walk in at the end, and I like, there was like people were buzzing, there's like an excitement, and I was like, what's going on? And they'd be like, oh, we just put Alloy in the crew, or we just put, whomever. And so this was one of those times I kind of just wandered into the scene, and like, everybody was like dapping everybody up and stuff. And I asked Casey what was going on. He's like, oh, we just put Pose and Arrow in the crew. And I was like, oh shit. I was like, oh, that's awesome. And then he said something like, it's like, you're an MSK, right? And I said, well, not really. I mean, and I kind of explained the situation. He's like, all right, well, you're in it too. So I felt like that was like enough of like a legit like invite rather than just like a throw in. And that's kind of like when that, was official, I guess.
That's awesome. I like it. It's kind of organic, like I can kind of relate to a little bit, like to sort of parts of that. I mean, when I got put in MSK, it was kind of a thing that I could tell was being talked about for quite a long time before it actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like a couple of incidents where it sort of people spilled the beans and I sort of realized what was going on, that I was being kind of auditioned or something. And then when it was official, it was a situation like that where everybody was together and it was sort of more of a celebration. But the way I got put in AWR was at the MSK meeting, and I was outside painting, and then Fate came running outside and told me to get inside. And I came inside and I was standing there and a whole bunch of people were being, put down or whatever.
Yeah.
And then Casey walked in and they sort of looked at me like, what are you doing there? And then they were like, oh, we want to put him in. And he goes, he's already family, whatever. It felt validating. It felt validating, but it also felt like, also like kind of very casual.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's cool though. I mean, I think that, and using this as a segue moment to talk about like kind of like transitioning from that moment into this kind of next phase, which was kind of, where the professionalism sort of came to be part of it. And Casey's a great person to mention because I think he was very pivotal in making that happen. I think he was one of the first people to kind of really consolidate and organize people from around the world together on set projects to kind of start bringing in, sponsorship and kind of working with brands and stuff like that.
Yeah.
To have these gallery spaces. He was with the Seventh Day Project was kind of the first instance of like really well produced, really slick looking video content on the internet, which sort of then became the norm. And much like skateboarding, we all suddenly are sort of getting sponsorship deals and opportunities to travel and exhibit and do all of these things. And it's right at this kind of interesting transitional moment where this kind of large-scale mural festival starts to pop off as a sort of a concept. Like when you came to New Zealand in 2002, I was organizing a little jam, like a graffiti jam. That was sort of normal. Yeah. And then we're going to Miami and we're being given lifts and as much paint as we want and a huge wall that's not just achievable on an A-frame ladder. Yeah. And it's a moment, right? So I just wondered if you want to talk a little bit about that transition and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, I would say, probably for me, a huge step in my development was just getting down with iron lac. I felt like just having consistent paint to, like just to kind of really get used to like a color palette that was, expanding and just even like at the beginning when the paint was kind of wonky or whatever, it was still like, I knew what it was. It wasn't like I had a can of like plastic coat and then like 3 like scrap cans of Krylon and like Rusto trying to like cobble something together with all like, pastel colors. Like that was kind of like the frequency I was on, for most of like the early days of graffiti, just getting whatever supplies I could and trying to make something happen with it. To have like a consistent supply of paint that had like good colors and they continue to like just increase the quality. That was huge for me, like being able to develop certain techniques that I was able to do and all that kind of stuff. And then, around that same time, I think as I was got that kind of boost to my painting just based on it being sponsored, there was these opportunities like, Art Basel, Primary Flight, all that kind of stuff. So it was just taking it to the next level, I guess, and, trying to seize those opportunities. I mean, I feel like sometimes now I almost feel a little guilty because the amount of like, the level that I would build up these painting situations in my head, it was like like, all right, this is the Super Bowl. Like, I gotta like come correct. I can't like just mail this one in. Like, this has gotta, like, every time I went out and like, you know, I would try and outdo myself, you know, every time I went out, but especially when it was like at a jam or at something like that, it's like, I can't half step. And like, just the not so much being competitive with other people, but just trying to like raise my game as high as I could was really something that I took super seriously, you know, to the point where like it was rare, but occasionally I would go to bed at a decent time of night just because I knew I was going to be painting and I wanted to be sharp, you know, which doesn't happen that often because my bedtime is usually around like 3 or 4 a.m. But, but yeah, I mean, I feel like I was really driven, you know, and it's kind of weird because, you know, you fast forward 20 years and you have like family and all that kind of stuff. Like, graffiti is still a big priority in my life, but there's other things that occupy that space that, you know, from when I was younger. But yeah, I think just, I one of the things I think is so alluring about graffiti is like, it's almost like a meditative practice. And, you know, because when you're in the middle of like painting a wall and it's like a nice day and you're like listening to music and hanging out with your friends or whatever, like there isn't anything else happening in the world, you know, like that it's just like you and the wall. And I really like that because there's not a lot of times where you can be like solely focused on, you know, something you enjoy doing that you're passionate about. But, you know, like those moments are like fleeting, you know, the older you get and the more you have to like, you know, scramble to pay bills and all that kind of stuff. So it's like, I really try and savor painting, you know, every opportunity I get.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, you're speaking to me directly because that's the moment I'm in now. You know, I'm working full time. I'm a parent for the first time.
Yeah.
I've had to be very stationary, like since the pandemic, and making a commitment to immigrating, you know, to a different country and kind of settling here and being present, you know, for my family, you know, which is like an absolute priority.
Yeah.
And I do think back to those times, those kind of very simple times where, you know, my ambitions were very similar. Like it was like, I mean, I'm not a religious person at all, but there were definitely times before I painted with like all you guys where I would like, it's almost like I was saying a little prayer, like, like let me do the dopest burner like anyone has ever seen. Like, let me blow up the internet with this. Like, that's how simple my life was, you know, at that time, you know, like, which is wild, you know.
Yeah.
But I think that, and I've come back to thinking about that time and thinking about it in light of 20 years, or, you know, it hasn't been 20, it's like 12, like 13 years since we were all at that second primary flight in Miami. And like how important like holding on to graffiti as our foundation should have been more, and aesthetically, like how many more of us should have, instead of feeling self-conscious about coming from graffiti and trying to reinvent ourselves as, you know, fine artists or, you know, figurative painters or anything, just continue to kind of elevate. And like, I think you and I think we can talk about this because I think like on one hand, for me, I feel like I very much was self-conscious and I was yo-yoing to and fro, like with these ideas of like, do I just be the best, most elaborate graffiti guy that just keeps building and building and building on this and getting it bigger and bigger, or do I develop something completely different? And then I started kind of pursuing these portrait paintings and kind of these other things. And I feel like you kind of stuck to your guns a little bit more in a sense that like you, and I think that what you created through that time was hugely influential. I think that a number of other artists have kind of riffed off of the foundation once again that I think that you set in kind of painting graffiti at a very, very high and elevated level, like painting it, like considering it more like a painting, you know, like an oil painting or something, like, but never deviating away from the core kind of principles of graffiti. And I feel like, you know, now we could look at some people like we could look at Does, and I've talked about how much I really love the murals that this guy Stare is doing at the moment, because they are just like letter based, but they're beautifully sort of rendered.
Yeah.
And I feel like a pang of kind of something, like I feel a bit like I feel like I've been robbed of opportunity, and it's not to take away from anybody else, robbed of opportunity to see a giant Ewok mural that's 20 stories high and is just like you doing pure Ewok. You know what I mean? I feel like you were almost doing this a little before people were ready for it, and before the kind of the maturity in the mural scene, and in regards to how people in the mural scene regard the graffiti people who contributed greatly to the kind of whole, kind of that whole movement, 10, 12 years ago. So, I mean, I'm venting a little bit. I'm expressing, what I think. How do you feel about that?
I mean, hearing you say that, like, I never really looked at it from that point of view. Like, I was just painting, trying to do my thing. I think, like, for whatever reason, when I first started, when I like considered myself like, oh, I'm a graffiti writer now, this is early on. I had very clear goals in terms of what I was trying to achieve. And like, there was a lot of kids that I felt like, I think everybody kind of approaches it to fulfill certain need they have. Some people are content to just do a lot of, freights, and they're not really like pushing the limits of style or anything. They're just quantity based people. And there's people that are like bombers and they just want to like be up everywhere, and there's people that like, like Jason that does everything well, for me, I think one of the main things I was trying to achieve as a graffiti writer was just contribute stuff stylistically to the, vernacular of graffiti, to kind of put my stamp on certain isms, in the same way that a lot of the, the spray can art, subway art era people sort of laid out these blueprints for us to kind of riff off of or whatever. I kind of wanted to add my, little contribution to the lexicon of like graffiti isms or whatever. And so, I feel like maybe I had a couple of little like trademark things that I've done over the years or whatever, but I don't know. Like, where am I going with this? I had a point and I kind of lost it.
Would you feel that?
It's tying it back to the big mural thing. Yeah. So I never because that was never really an option in the way that it is now. I was never thinking about it like that. I was thinking about it from the standpoint of just doing like graffiti. That was a reflection of what, my goals or my aesthetic was. And now that like the whole muralism movement is kind of a thing, like, I wish, I guess I would like to do more of that stuff. One of the, and I guess this is where I was going with it. One of the things I was trying to crack the code on this, and I never really did, but I've seen people do it, and when somebody has such a dope idea that you're like pissed at them because you didn't come up with it first. Like, and I was actively thinking about how do I make this thing work? Like I kind of stepped back from graffiti. This was probably 10 or 15 years ago. I was talking to Pose about this one time, and I was saying, how do we do what we do that has all the integrity of letter-based graffiti, but can be appreciated and digestible to like normies? Because it's not like I was trying to make it like mass appeal graffiti or like water it down. I wanted it to maintain like all the integrity, but what I wanted to try and, it was more like just a puzzle I was trying to solve was, I feel like graffiti is a very divisive thing, especially, 15 years ago when a lot of the propaganda around it is like, it's the scary gang shit that people do to ruin your property value or whatever. And so I knew right away, like most normies, as soon as they saw anything, regardless of what it was actually being painted, if they saw you were using spray paint, they were automatically like, oh, that's that other stuff that, is bringing down our property value. So what I was trying to do was like, how do we get those people to like our stuff just as much as the graffiti writers like our stuff? And I never really, I never really figured it out. But like you said, you know, people like Does, he came later, but the guy Stare does amazing stuff where it's like, I feel like it hits on a couple different levels where like right away a graffiti writer will look at that stuff and be like, oh yeah, that's graffiti, and they might recognize his style or whatever. But a normie might just see like a really nice like color palette and like pattern, you know. And I think like hitting on multiple frequencies was kind of what I was going for. And I think another person that did it really well, where like they maintained the integrity of graffiti, but kind of repackaged it in a way that was a little more palatable to people, where they might not even know that it was graffiti, was Wayne was doing these walls that were like kind of more like murally type. I mean, it would still look like Wayne pieces, but just the way that he kind of formatted it was different than how he would paint like a truck or something. And
yeah, I've made no secret of how much I love those Wayne murals. Like,
yeah,
I just think
incredible.
I just think they're like kind of perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I actually told him one time when he was in Minneapolis for Soundset, I was like, you cracked the code on something that I've been thinking about for like a couple of years, and I never figured out how to do it. You know, because I think like when you're doing graffiti, you're very tunnel vision. It's even hard to like break out of your patterns just within like your letter structures a lot of times. So going that far away from like the format or the composition of how you go about painting a piece, and you know, like especially because like most pieces kind of fit in a, you know, shape like about this, whereas like if you have a wall that's, you know, portrait style, that's you know 10 stories tall and, you know, more tall than it is wide, you have to figure out how do I make what I do work in this space.
And I think like the Germans were kind of like had an interesting way of kind of tackling that early on, you know, like, but they kind of did a lot of these kind of environmental kind of like things where they rendered their letters like it was an object or a creature or something, and they kind of took it beyond the frame. Yeah. Especially like Lumet is somebody who always was very conscious of creating a sense of kind of tension and then dimension. I'm kind of like quoting him directly because there's something he said to me one time. Yeah. And I thought that was magic, you know. And then I think like Dime kind of perfected on that in the sense that he removed all of the other pictorial kind of embellishments and allowed these big three-dimensional kind of forms to kind of expand and fill or go beyond the space. Yeah. You know, and so there was a sense that what you're looking at is larger than what you're just looking at, which, you know, it does something to the viewer, you know, which I think is really important. It's not just kind of boxed in and contained. It's something that does very well as well, you know, so which is for sure. Is really cool. And I like that, you know, I like that approach very much. I like it much more that people have got away from feeling that they need to camouflage or disguise their graffiti as anything else. You know, they allow it to stand on its own, which I think is really important. I feel passionate as an artist, as an art lover, you know, but also working as an agent in this field. I feel like very passionate about protecting this type of art and making sure it always is front and center. Yeah. You know, as opposed to kind of always getting like minimized and swept away, especially because a lot of the best mural artists that have been in the scene for the last decade and a bit came out of graffiti.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard thing for like normies to kind of wrap their head around it, because it's like, what are these names? I can't read it. I like the colors sometimes, or I like the little, you know, Garfield character next to it or whatever, because those are the things that they can identify with. Like, the nuances of like style and graffiti and letters and being able to even read what it says, let alone know why somebody's spent 30 years writing the word Ewok or, you know, whatever. Like, it's kind of lost on most people. So I was trying to like short circuit that sort of alienation that maybe people that just haven't happened upon graffiti or been able to learn about it enough to appreciate it could still kind of enjoy something that was legitimately graffiti, but, had something that sort of like a bridge to bring them into it or whatever. I think to a lot of people that are uninitiated, graffiti could be like, like Chinese, like kanji calligraphy or something. Like, it looks cool, but I don't know what it says. Like, you can only go so far in your appreciation when you don't know, like, the circumstances around it or that type of thing. So,
yeah, absolutely. Somebody else I reckon is like really significant for kind of breaking the boundaries of it is Delta too, from Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Like, and it kind of exploring all the different ways it can be elevated and explored, like as sculpture, as product, as illustration, as assemblage, as like sculptural relief, as animation, like, and there's so many different ways that it can be kind of explored and yet still kind of retain its integrity.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah. I think lately, you've been focused a lot on studio work, and they started off as kind of small works on paper. And I've definitely seen some different phases of you working out what you want to do in your studio practice, from very kind of meticulously rendered oil paintings to now finding something that's abstract and looks a little faster to paint, but also is organic in the way that a lot of your pieces are, and feels like there's more of a connection. The sort of monochromatic and organic kind of forms, they look like they're started very loosely, and then you kind of find and define different areas to kind of enhance that, And have you found that process kind of liberating on any level, or inspiring of like what you'd want to do on a larger wall context?
Yeah, I definitely want to paint some of those abstract pieces like on a bigger scale, either on walls or just bigger canvases or whatever. I think like everything I work on, it kind of goes through a cycle, and the process, like I'll stumble upon something that feels good or feels right, and I'll do that for a while, and then I start establishing a pattern on how I go about doing it. And it just makes me feel really uneasy that I'm just kind of like following a format or a game plan. So I try and break out of that format, and then it gets really frustrating because it's like I have like a new wall to break down. It kind of swings back and forth between feeling really intuitive and, like coming to me really easily. And then I just start overthinking it, and it kind of grinds to a halt, and I'm like having trouble finishing pieces. But ultimately, like the whole point of why I started doing these abstract pieces was I like the challenge of making something where there's nothing to like compare it to determine whether it's right or whether it's finished. It's just gotta feel right, And I think maybe that's part of the enjoyment in looking at abstract work too, is that it just feels right. Like it doesn't have to mean anything or say anything or have any kind of representational value to it, but it just makes you feel a certain type of way.
And that maybe connects a bit better to kind of like your process in graffiti too, because what a lot of people don't really realize is true about a lot of people in MSK and AWR, but the pieces are freestyled. Like most of us have gone off that approach, and that things are very rarely pre-planned, and we really do kind of explore through the process. Finding this right level, this push and pull and everything, like much like an abstract painter in the studio would.
Yeah. I mean, I feel it's kind of like I think when you start like just like committing to freestyling pieces, it kind of builds up that muscle or that confidence that you can do that. Like it's pretty daunting to just go from like going to the wall every time with sketches to like, oh, I'm just gonna but I kind of realized that there's a lot of stuff that you don't even really need to look at sketch. If I do that at home, I can remember like 85% of it. So I don't need to bring the sketch. And then Oh, is that the train?
That's the train. This is we're keeping it really authentic here on this podcast.
Yeah.
I have a very busy freight line that runs directly past my studio. It's literally one block that way, and depending on what sort of train it is, I think that wasn't a freight. Like that sounded like an Amtrak because they just honk their horn. They have to honk them at every intersection.
Gotcha.
As they go down the road, so that's what they're doing because they're all level. Like crossing. So anyway, sorry about that. It makes it a cameo on every single podcast.
What was I talking about? I don't remember.
I think we were just talking about the freestyling and building up the muscle memory.
As it relates to abstract stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like, it's like a constant process of like one of the things I've been doing with the abstract pieces is try to use. I notice like when I use a paintbrush to paint stuff, I get sucked into my patterns of how I paint with a brush. So I try to like find weird stuff to apply the paint where it's almost like I'm steering it, but I'm not driving it. Like I'm kind of like, I know something needs to go here, but I can't be too specific about like every millimeter of what's happening. I just have to like react once it's there. So I started just using like more awkward tools to put the paint on the canvas because I think it makes you do stuff that you couldn't really do or achieve or think of otherwise. And then reacting to that and kind of curating within these sort of imprecise tools is a challenge, but I think it yields a lot of interesting results. I don't know.
That's awesome. I mean, I think it's cool. I think it's really healthy, and I think it's it's something that's really hard to explain to somebody who's expecting a very specific thing. Like if somebody, like when you go through the process of kind of working with a client to create a mural. Like they want to present you with a brief, and then they want you to respond to the brief, and then they want to have input, and they want to see a few iterations and changes before it's sort of agreed upon what it's going to be. And there's this whole kind of process of handing over trust to an artist. The kind of the premise at the beginning is kind of one of like an artist having to prove that they're able to interpret something and be professional about it. And then gradually they sort of, take the guardrails off and let you do what you do, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's always a hard sell, but it's something that, once again, I'm also very passionate about pushing and promoting. It's one of the reasons why you were an artist that I wanted to work with, on our mural roster. Like I know the weight of what you've done and achieved in one context, and I know exactly how it can transfer, and it's about bridging that gap and it kind of explaining, which is why having a conversation like this and putting it out there is like super important, because this type of exploration through art and kind of allowing an artist to be truly curious, it's a big part of what makes art exciting. For sure. And I feel like sometimes it's missing from public space because people really, really want to restrict what that looks like to kind of box it in, So there's no surprises.
When you were saying that, it kind of reminded me of this thing I discovered like way too late in my career. But I sort of feel like as an artist, you have this like fork in the road, even if you don't know that it's there, or you've already like chosen to go one way or the other without even really seeing that you had a different option. But I kind of feel like what you were saying about like the client wanting to, like go back and forth and like have input and this, that, and the other. I feel like, if I had the magical like reset button to like do my life over or whatever, and the person I think of specifically when I think about like the fork in the road is, are you familiar with the guy Aaron Horkey, who's like illustrator?
Yeah.
He's amazing. And I feel like he did it right because he's always been like crazy talented, and he just developed his talent exponentially within the span of like 5 years. Like he's another like Minneapolis dude that I kind of came up with. He was actually graffiti writer as well. But when I look at the path of his career, I was like, damn, he really did it right. Like I feel like just having that faith in yourself and faith in your talent and just charging forward with it. I felt like it was sort of instilled in me from the very beginning that, you know, being an artist is like, you know, this impossible task. Like you're going to be a starving artist. You're going to have to just like live in your car or like sell your paintings out of a van, you know, on the side of like a freeway overpass or something like that. Like this is like what was instilled in me growing up. And so any opportunity I had where I could do something marginally creative in like a corporate type of setting, I jumped on it because it was like, oh man, I can get paid to design t-shirts or this, that, or the other thing. But the trap in that is, you know, you do that, you turn around and you've been making t-shirts for 15 years. And for what? Like, doesn't matter. Like you might make some cool shirts and maybe, you know, you'll see on Entertainment Tonight, you know, a celebrity might wear one of your t-shirts, you know, once every 3 years or whatever. And you get a little thrill out of that at the beginning, but it's just kind of a waste of time. Like when you think about like, you know, Elliot, who's the dopest t-shirt designer of all time?
Yeah, I mean, I
doesn't matter. Nobody knows.
I will say that you designed a t-shirt that I had no idea you designed. My wife and I went to the TDE Championship Tour show at Madison Square Garden, and my wife was just drawn to the scissor shirt. Yeah. And she wasn't even at the time like a huge scissor fan. Yeah. Like now, since her last album, she is. But like at that point, but she was like, this shirt has such a timeless quality. And then she was like, what do you think of the shirt? And I said, whoever designed this shirt knows what they're doing. I was like, look at the color separation, like look at what he did, look at the transition and the outline color, like look at this. I was showing all these things. I was like, this person deeply understands the process of designing a shirt to be screen printed with the least amount of colors and get the most effective result. Yeah. And then lo and behold, one day I find out you designed it. And
how did you even figure that out?
I think you might have like alluded to it or posted it on Instagram one time, just off the cuff, like years after the fact. Okay. I was like, what? You did that? Like, that's so crazy because I like, honestly, I went on one of these big passionate rants at the merch stand about how this is a shirt, and this shirt has stood the test of time. I mean, she still has the shirt. She still wears the shirt. You know what I mean? So I feel like there's something in that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I feel like, you know, learning how to do these different things, these practical things where you know, you can do color separations and all that is cool, you know, but I feel like the purpose of that should be redirected towards your own work rather than just like pumping out products for a corporation to sell. And I
feel like ultimately it is though, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I have a slightly different perspective in the sense that I feel like everything that I've done, even the things that I've done that felt so frustrating to do and such a distraction from what I wanted to do, have all had such practical applications to what I do as an artist. Like, I feel like every lesson that has been learned has been valuable and has been applied. Even like when I worked as a dispatcher in a stainless steel appliance factory and learned how to box up and package and ship things correctly. Like even when I packed flowers at the flower market that my mom worked at, you know, like, and sent boxes of flowers around the country. I learned things about the freight system, you know, within my country that then were applied when I was working as an artist, you know, like same, you know, designing album covers, working on music videos, like such huge distractions from my ultimate goal of being like the greatest artist ever, you know what I mean? And yet
there's things that just carry through,
Yeah.
Maybe we're supposed to have a success rate,
there's definitely value that you can pick up. And if you end up in a situation where you're working, a 9 to 5 and you can do something marginally creative, just try and extract as much, personal value out of that you can apply to your own stuff, like down the road or whatever. I don't think it's a total waste of time, but where I was going with the like fork in the road thing is I feel like early on, Aaron Horkey was like, I'm going to be like the dopest illustrator of all time. And he just plowed forward with that. Whereas like one of my biggest regrets is like, somebody needs like a graphic designer for this or, work for this company, this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, you get lured into a situation where you can support yourself, more or less doing that. But the time slips away quick, and all the ground that you've lost in doing the thing that you really want to get to at some point, somebody's already on that path and has been doing it the same amount of time that you've been, working in an office, doing shit that doesn't really add a lot of value to your life overall, So that's like one of my regrets. But, I feel like since COVID happened, I kind of just decided I'm not going to work at a company ever again unless they want to pay me a ton of money and I can still do essentially what I want to do. I hate every aspect of like asking permission if I need to go on a trip to go paint or something. Like, these are the things that I'm going to like take with me throughout my life. And on my deathbed, I'm going to remember going to New Zealand or going to Barcelona, like painting graffiti, and like all these memories are so much more valuable to me than making my 100th like surf skate industry t-shirt or whatever, I just don't want to trade that stuff away. And I want to, figure out how to make it work doing the shit that I want to be doing and figure out a way to get paid doing that as well.
I totally hear you. I think that's awesome. And I feel like there's big things still looming on the forefront for you, man.
It's going to happen sooner or later. I just, hopefully sooner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.